So I'm very excited to be here today to talk a little bit about my research methods, some things to think about. I do want to preface it with saying I am by no means an expert at this, and I was talking with my father, and he said I'm a what did he say? Like an expert in training. And so I like to think of myself in that way. But I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about some of these methodologies that might be utilized by other researchers who are thinking of ways to capture sort of the depth and the breadth of the data that they collect. So that's what I am hoping to do today. So this is just my quick welcome, asking everyone to turn off their mics, of course, but if questions come up, feel free to ask them. I'm going to try to be watching the chat as well as the hand raising, but feel free to, if you need to interrupt me at some point to ask a question, that's fine as well. And hopefully this will not be boring. Hopefully you will get some nuggets of wisdom from it and have fun while you're learning about my research and some different methodologies. Now, as I already stated, this is what I'll be talking about today. And specifically, I'm going to introduce some qualitative and quantitative procedures that I use to analyze some book preferences with young children, and how I use some mixed methodologies. And I consider myself to be a quantitative researcher, but also use some qualitative informed methodologies is how I like to look at it. So this is what the agenda looks like as far as some of the things that I will be discussing. And then, of course, I'll have some time for questions at the end as well. So let's jump into it. This is me. I'm JaNay Brown-Wood. I'm an educator. I'm actually an assistant professor in the Child and Adolescent Development Department here at Sac State. My degrees are in psychology and child development and in education. I'm also a researcher and a scholar, as you'll see today. I'm not going to talk too much about this part because that's what a lot of this presentation is about. But I do research and scholarly work related to diversity in children's books. I'm also a mother and a wife, and I think this is an important thing to think about because it influences some of the work I do, especially when I think about making a better future for my daughter, Vivian. So that's a bit about me as a mother. And I'm a children's author. I write children's picture books and chapter books and also middle grades as well. And I write poetry too. So as you see, children's literature is definitely something that is near and dear to my heart. And then this piece is just another aspect thinking about my positionality when it comes to this work as a Black, cisgendered, heterosexual woman. I'm California born. And as I already stated, mother, wife, sister. I really do consider myself to be more of a quantitative researcher who utilizes some qualitative informed methods as well. And I also like to say that I did not grow up with many book characters that looked like me. And I think that had some lasting effects and informs some of the work that I do. And then I also believe that all children deserve to see themselves in books, and also to hear stories that are different than theirs. And so often my research centers on race. So that's a bit about me. Now, I know for many of you, this is you know a lot of this information, but I thought it's a good idea to just start off with a refresher about qualitative versus quantitative methods. And so I'm presenting this through, again, my lens, the way I look at this work, and especially as you're thinking about how you might be able to utilize some of these methodologies when you're doing your own work. So quantitative, you know that this is very much looking at numbers, right? It's utilizing objective measurements, statistics, numerical analysis of data. You might present things like polls and questionnaires and surveys to pull this information. And it's very much centered around gleaning, pooling all this data, analyzing the numbers to see if you can make a more generalizable conclusion. So much of the focus on quantitative has to do with, again, looking at measurements and numbers, relationships between these variables, not necessarily processes, right? Additionally, as I stated already, this data is gathered often with structured research instruments like your survey, like a test or an assessment. It utilizes larger sample sizes as a hope to, again, get this accurate representation of population from the sample that you gather data from. The hope is that the methodologies that you use can be repeated and replicated and are reliable. And so research questions are definitely driven, looking for these objective answers. Um, so this is, again, just sort of reiterating some of these pieces that I've talked about. Quantitative, quantity, numbers. Then on the other side, of course, these are your qualitative types of methods. And from my understanding, the way I look at it, it's very much, again, focusing on qualities of things and on processes. And you could be looking at things that are socially constructed, determining these intimate relationships between the researcher and what's being studied. So it's not necessarily looking at these numbers and being pulled from tests, but looking at these processes and these relationships and these intricacies that exist within the individuals that you're studying. It's striving to answer these questions that focus on, again, these social experiences. And this form of inquiry can be considered by many social and behavioral scientists as much as this perspective on how to approach investigating a research problem as it is a method. So it's kind of looking at it as a method, but also getting, again, these very nuanced understandings and these intricacies in those individuals who you are studying. And so it could be studied within the real world situation. It's non-manipulative, non-controlling, depending on the way that you're doing it. It's purposeful and selective. And often the information that you're getting, it's coming from your data. You're not going in necessarily looking for something, but you're trying to see what emerges naturally. And so you're purposeful and selective in the types of methods and ways that you're doing that, and also analyzing the data that you pull. So again, that's kind of like, I guess, a quick and dirty on how I see quantitative versus qualitative methods. And another way I like to think of it is, again, sort of quantitative is looking at this breadth, right? It's looking at this sort of wide range of things and pulling as much data as you can from large sample sizes. Whereas qualitative feels more like going in depth. Maybe your sample size is much smaller, but you're going into more depth, looking for these nuances in these processes as you are collecting and analyzing your data. Now, I wanted to, I think that this works as a sort of a comparison, likening this to baking a cake. Now, for some of you who know me, I love baking. I love eating those things too, which is not so much a good thing. But anyway, I love baking. And so I wanted to put it through this lens of baking a cake. On the quantitative side, you can think of getting a recipe that tells you what ingredients to include in your cake, right? And it's numbers: 2.5 cups of flour, 3/4 cups of butter. It's these numbers that are specific. You need to stick to these to help you make this perfect, in this case, easy chocolate cake. Whereas on the other side, I think of quantitative as being, well, wait a minute, you said flour. What type of flour? Are we talking about wheat flour? Is it cake flour? Is it all purpose? What about your leavener? Is it baking soda or is it baking powder? What type of salt? We're talking about fine salt, Himalayan salt, black salt, cocoa. You call for cocoa. Is this Dutch cocoa? Is it, just basic unsweetened cocoa? So even with eggs, are these brown eggs? So I think of like qualitative as not is looking at, again, these nuances and using these nuances to help you then get the best flavor, the best rise, the best cake that's possible. And so again, quantitative being very much tied to these numbers. qualitative, looking at some of these more nuanced aspects. But from both of them, you can get a pretty decent cake, right? But now what happens though if you combine aspects of the two? You've got the numbers, but then you also have some of this nuance. Could this perhaps lead to an even more delicate cake? So I think I saw a question jump in. Oh, okay. So mixed methods. Again, mixed methods research design is this procedure for collecting, analyzing, and mixing both the quantitative and the qualitative in research in this single study to understand a research problem. So it's taking, again, that recipe, but it's also including the nuance of the ingredients and all of this that you use for your cake to then develop this even more layered and delicious cake. And so this is kind of how I think about mixed methods. It allows for you, again, this breadth and this depth and to capture the numbers, but also to capture some of the nuances as well. Now, these are some examples of my stimuli, okay? This is the part of my study that looks at book covers. And so I want to just take a moment and I want you to think about like, what kind of data might you be able to capture with these book covers? And let me actually see. I'm gonna go off script a little, I think. I'm gonna stop sharing really quickly because what I'm gonna do is I have developed a Jamboard with these questions. Let's see if this works. Technology has been hit and missed this week for me. So we're gonna go for it anyway. So I'm gonna drop in the chat this Jamboard. And I'm gonna ask you to click that Jamboard and it should take you to a screen that looks like this. Can you just, humor me? Jump on in here looking at this Jamboard. And so specifically, what I want you to do is, again, think about what kind of data might you capture with these book covers? And even more nuanced, like what data might you collect? What sort of research questions might you ask? What kind of methods might you use? So I don't know if you're familiar with Jamboard. You can just use a little sticky note, write up whatever comes to mind with thinking about these stimuli that I'm presenting to you, and then stick them there. And just let's see what kind of ideas you come up with as far as what kind of data might you capture utilizing these book covers. So I give you a few moments. If anyone is going to be a taker for me, give it a shot. And I should say I have 3 different sheets here. Oh, great. I see some popping up. 3 different sheets here. Just, I wasn't sure how many individuals might be joining us today. Oh, so I see some awesome stuff going on here. All right. I love it. Okay. Any others? I see some more popping in. I appreciate you guys humoring me, jumping in on my little activity here. So I see a couple different things coming up. All right. So just based on some who have joined us on this Jamboard, I see frequency of the book being chosen by children. How are children represented on these book covers? How many children are displayed in these book covers? What content of this book might have? What might be the content based on the covers? What toys are children depicted in using in children's books? All really awesome questions. Now I'm going to push you a little bit more, and this might be a little bit more challenging, or you might even be able to think of both ways. But based on your questions, would you say the question that you put on here is quantitative or qualitative or both? So now I'm going to ask you to go back into the sticky that you created and see if you can kind of pick. Yeah, I think this is quantitative or qualitative, or perhaps both. Okay, I see some changes happening. And hopefully you guys are seeing the Jamboard on my screen too. I'm not sure. Okay. I see a qualitative. How are children represented in the children's books? Interesting. So perhaps taking a bunch of children's books and looking at how they're being represented and really using that data to drive what you're finding. I see someone said qualitative and mixed methods. What toys are children depicted using children's books? Okay. Let's see. Mixed methods, looking at statistics between demographics and which book is chosen, and then their impressions of it. Really, really awesome, guys. So I think I'm gonna now stop sharing this and go back to Lisa. I'm very glad that you said you're gonna edit this. So you guys already hit many on the head. You saw that with depending on your stimuli, you could utilize it for quantitative or qualitative type studies, right? And then you can again get this more nuanced depiction of whatever your questions are being asked by utilizing the two of those. And that is very much what I try to do with my study. And I think a few of you already hit on that in the Jamboard. I use these to capture book selection preferences of children aged 5 to 7 years old, including numbers, but also patterns. So now I want to set a little bit of the context for my research looking at picture book covers. This is the preference piece of my research. So a little bit of context. My work is very much tied to things like racial biases, oral language and narrative ability, picture books and the lack of diversity, and how this might tie to academic outcomes. Now, for the purpose of this study, I don't think I'm going to have time to get to the oral language and narrative ability piece. We'll see what time looks like. But I am going to do a little bit more of focusing with the racial biases and the picture books and lack of diversity. As I'm kind of showing you how I utilize some of these different qualitative and quantitative methodologies. So starting off with some basic information about biases in children. There are these doll studies that were done by Drs. Clark and Clark in the 30s and 40s. And from this doll study, they were able to see that their children do have preferences based on race. And so they would take black dolls and white dolls and put them in front of children and say things like, which is the nice one? Which is the good one? Which one do you want to play with? That sort of thing. And then capture children's racial biases based on that. And so what literature suggests is that we have both implicit and explicit biases. Implicit being these biases that we are unaware of and that are just happening and might influence our behavior in ways that we don't even realize. Whereas explicit being we are aware of them. And so then we might be able to change some of our behaviors because we're aware of them. And so this comes out in this way. So this is explicit biases. And research actually shows that implicit bias actually stays pretty consistent through childhood into adulthood, again, because it's unconscious and we don't necessarily have control over it. But explicit biases tend to decrease around between ages 7 and 10 into adulthood, which speaks to why I selected the age range that I did for the children that I worked with, because before 10, you have a higher likelihood of being able to capture explicit biases if they are present. So some additional research has shown, again, some of these biases within different groups. And research on adults have shown that white adults tend to show this sort of in-group favoritism, basically preference for their own group, whereas Black adults do not. And some of the studies also show that this is similar for young children as well. Studies also have shown that white children aged 7 to 11 show this in-group bias where Black children don't. And even for Hispanic children aged 5 to 12, which this is very interesting, when comparing Hispanic groups to Black, did not show an in-group out-group bias. But when comparing Hispanics versus white, these Hispanics weren't necessarily showing this in-group bias, if that makes sense. So we see again early on that these biases are present and that they can influence how we see ourselves, see others, and some of the behaviors that we engage in. Now, looking at children's picture books and the lack of diversity within them, we know that picture books have many different benefits. And as Walter Dean Meyer says, books transmit values, they explore our common humanity. And through picture books, children get practice with things like awareness of print and concepts of print, learning information from pictures, starting to have an impact on their own awareness of the self and identity development. Interactions, starting to learn that there are interactions between pictures and text. And so even picture books being utilized as a research tool to allow for capturing things like narratives. So picture books have lots of benefits and also are helpful for researchers to capture things like children's language skills when utilizing them. But picture books also serve as what Dr. Bishop calls doors, windows, and mirrors, or better yet, mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors. And so a mirror being that books can reflect your experience back at you, reflect you back to yourself. So in other words, picking up a book with a young Black girl who likes baking, right, and books, and I'm reading about her, I can connect to that character because it's as if I'm getting a mirror reflecting my own experiences back to me. But picture books can also be doors or windows, giving readers an opportunity to take a glimpse into someone else's experience, to step into someone else's experience through the books that they're reading. And so ultimately, perhaps building compassion because of this, especially when being able to see, hey, even though this person's background might be different than mine, we do still have some similarities and connecting in that way. Now, I just really quickly want to show you what the diversity in children's books looks like. And I know this is 2018, but I believe, I can't remember if the 2019, 2020 depiction has come out quite yet. But as you see that there is a major lack of diversity in children's books, and generally white protagonists tend to be represented in children's books at a much larger rate than people of color. And if you even look at, for example, animals or inanimate objects being represented at a higher rate than these other protagonists of color, and in some cases combined. So there's a major lack of diversity in children's books, even though we know children's books can be, as I said, mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors, and have these other benefits. It just leads you to wonder, well, what are we missing when we don't have the right type of numbers, right? An accurate, or better, a more representative depiction of different stories within books. So this then leads me to talk a little bit about children's book preferences, which is something that I tested. Research does show that there are different things that can influence children's preferences, such as genres, types of text, features, age of child, and while there's not a lot of research that's done on this, there was a study that showed that for Hispanic and non-Hispanic first graders in Moore's study, that they were actually more likely to pick nonfiction books compared to fiction books. And even when racial characters were included, these children were less likely to pick those and were more likely to pick nonfiction books or books about animals. But then that led me to wonder, what about in cases where it's just humans? If you take out the object, what about those cases? And so this is what sort of informed the work that I did. My research question was this, or one of them was, does the race of the protagonist on the cover of a book affect a child's interest or preference to read that book? And so I hypothesized that based on what I know about racial biases, based on what I know about preferences for children's books, that yeah, there would be a difference. There would be, we would see variation in preferences. So now to jump into a little bit more of my methods, I use children who were kindergarten, first and second graders from a very large, diverse school district. And I did use some other assessments like receptive vocabulary and expressive vocabulary, but those were more so for the work that I did looking at narrative abilities. For the picture book part of my study, I used a book cover task that was very similar to what I explained earlier with Dr. Clark, using the black and white dolls, but instead using picture book covers. So these are just a couple examples of picture book covers that I utilized, and everything about them are identical, with only the difference being the race of the character. So if you see here, it's a black boy. He's got characteristics that align to a black individual, like curly hair and dark eyes. Whereas here, same thing, it's a white boy. Everything else is similar, except for these characteristics that are related to race. And so I used 6 different picture book covers, and I tried to think of themes that were universal for many children, like playing a game or playing with toys. And so utilized those for my methods. And what I did is I put these books in front of children, and generally I switched the whether or not, like for example, the black book is on the left or on the right. And so I tried to counterbalance that. And I would ask, out of these 2 books, which one would you like to read the most? Why? And then take note of that. And then would ask, well, why wouldn't you like to read this one? And take note of that. And do the same thing for all 6 of the book covers that I utilized in my study. I see a really great question from Jennifer. Did I look at different genders on the book covers? I didn't for this study, but I absolutely plan to. And actually, right now, my research is looking at race, but I plan to expand to other aspects of diversity as well, like socioeconomic status, family composition, those different pieces. Those are definitely on my plan of other things to investigate. So anyway, I used these 6 different books, asked them which one would you like to read and why wouldn't you like to read that one, and captured their words and their preferences to analyze. So now looking at this quantitative piece and how I did this. So this is just again what it looked like for this study. I used white, Hispanic, and Black children. Most of them were on the free and reduced lunch program, which speaks to socioeconomic status. Mean age was about 6. And this is the way that I coded it. So if the book was preferred, it got a 1. If it was not, it got a 0. And so this is how I then went through and coded the selections that the children indicated. And so I did a couple different things. One of the things that I did was I summed the black and white book selections. And so in other words, I summed up how many times the children said they preferred the white book or they preferred the black book. And as you see here, there's a difference in preference where the white book, based on the children in my study, on average, were preferred more times than the black book. Now, I did some ANOVAs, some ANCOVAs. I'm not going to go into all of those details, but I will say that, for example, I used an ANCOVA and looked at the race of the tester and other demographics. But what I'm going to focus on here is the ANOVA, the analysis of variance that I did. And I found that there was a significant difference in preference between the Black children and the Hispanic children, showing that the Hispanic and Latino children on average preferred the Black book less than the Black children did. Found something similar with the white children as well, where the white children were less likely to prefer the Black book. And for the Black children, there wasn't really a difference in the preference between the Black book or the white book. And so then when comparing the white and the Hispanic children, I don't know if you can see this on the bottom here, there was no significant difference between the white and Hispanic children with their preference for the Black book. So this is what it looks like in numbers, right? I'm looking at the summations, the Black books versus the white books, and breaking it down based on the ethnicity of the children that I used. And so again, this white book for the white children and for the Hispanic children were chosen as preference at a much higher rate than the Black book was, whereas we didn't see the same thing for the Black children. Now, another analysis that I did, and really I utilized this analysis in another iteration that I did this of this study, which I'll share a little bit about, but I utilized what's called a chi-square test. And even for me, like I said, I'm an expert in training. I'm still learning some of the nuances of some of these tests, but I used the chi-square test and now looked at my groups as categories, the preferred category and the not preferred category. And so to give you a little introduction to chi-square analysis, or also known as like goodness of fit, this is a statistic that can analyze the relationship between two categorical variables. And so when we're talking about categorical variables, we're talking about ones that are like non-numerical. So now me looking at this based on category, preferred, not preferred. And so some other examples of categorical variables are like eye color, categories of animals, etc. And so the chi-squared statistic can actually tell you how much difference exists between what you observe and what you expect if there's no relationship that existed within that specific population. And actually, you can utilize SPSS to run this test. So what I want to do now, I'm going to switch over and show you. Oh, actually, I think I might. That's probably really small for you guys. So I'm going to stop sharing this for a moment and move to show you just a short video that's this introduction to the chi-square. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of it, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it just fine.
We're going to look at how to run a chi-square test in SPSS. Now, I've got a database with some health statistics, and we're going to use gender and smoking status. So whether the person is smoking or not. Now, the reason I'm going to use these two is because we usually use a chi-square test when we have two nominal variables. Now, remember, nominal is data that has no meaningful rank or order. So smoker, non-smoker,
JaNay, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can barely hear the volume.
Oh gosh, I'm glad you interrupted about that. Let me try this and see if this works.
Thank you. If you can start from the beginning, especially.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, thank you. Hopefully this will work. Okay, I'm going to take my earphones out though, so I don't blast my own ears. So let's see.
We're going to look at how to run a chi-square test.
Is that better, Basha?
And interpret the output. Now, I've got a database with some health statistics, and we're going to use gender and smoker or smoking status, so whether the person's a smoker or a non-smoker. Now, the reason I'm going to use these two is because we usually use a chi-square test when we have two nominal variables. Now, remember, nominal is data that has no meaningful rank or order. So smoker, non-smoker, male, female, they're definitely nominal variables. So let's go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and Crosstabs. I'm going to reset, and I'm going to put in gender and smoker. It doesn't really matter which way around you do it. I've just chosen to put it this way. We're going to go to cells, and I want to show you the expected count. I briefly mentioned this in the video on crosstabs. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail. I'm not going to use any percentages this time, and go ahead and click continue. We go to statistics. We're going to tick the chi-squared option. Now, chi-squared is a test for independence, or you can think of it as a correlation coefficient, a test for an association. It just tells you if the association is significant, but doesn't tell you how strong it is. So we're going to use an effect size, either phi or Kramer's V, depending on the size of the table. So I'm going to go ahead and tick that box there. Go ahead and click continue, and then click OK. Okay, let's look at our first table. This has our crosstabs, and we have our observed count, and we have our expected count. Now, the expected count is what we would expect to observe if there was no association. So, for example, if gender had no relationship with smoking status, so gender was independent from whether or not someone smoked, we would expect to observe around 39 males who are smokers and 47 or 48 males who are non-smokers. Similarly, we would expect to observe around 40 females who were smokers and around 49 females who were non-smokers. Now we can see our observed counts are different from these expected, and the chi-square test helps determine if those observed counts are different enough for the test to be significant or for the association to be significant.
All right, I'm going to stop it there and turn this down so I don't blast my ears. Okay. Give me 1 second. All right, are we back to seeing my PowerPoint? Okay, awesome. Perfect, thank you guys. All right, so as you saw within, hopefully you were able to hear it better that second time. This chi-square helps you to determine whether what you saw observed and whether it was right at what you expected or above or below. And so when I looked at my Black book cover preferences, I found, now you'll see down here, these are all the different names of the book covers that I used. I found that if we're looking at this expected, for the Black book cover, the expected list, that it was often this dark one, often ranked as least preferred at higher than expected and ranked most preferred at lower than expected. And we see converse the same thing for the white book cover, but it was picked as most preferred at higher than expected and least preferred at lower than expected. So this again is giving me indication that there is a difference in preference, and often it's the white book that's being chosen as preferred. Now, I'm doing some additional analyses into this to really determine some of the why, but it's very interesting that, as you see, for some of the, there's variance between some of the titles. So for example, for the white children, there was a significant difference in preference when looking at the rocket, which is this one, the jar, the egg, and the tooth, but not for the other two. And we see a same thing here for Hispanic children for those titles. So that's going to be something interesting for me to delve deeper into to see if I can get at some of the why. But again, for the Black children, not really seeing this significant difference in preferences for those books. Now, I brought up that I'd done a different iteration of the study as well. And as the research suggested, often children are picking nonfiction over fiction, or picking things like animals over people. And so I did another version of this test. And what was very interesting, and here again are some of the examples of what it looked like, everything being pretty close to identical except for has a child, doesn't have a child. And so for this iteration of the study, I looked at just Hispanic and Asian children. And the preference was then no preference, second preference, or preferred, and utilizing the chi-square for this as well. And what's very interesting is if you see here, for what was observed, again, for Black Book being most preferred, it was way under what was expected. It was closer for being second place, and then 30 compared to 18 for not preferred. But what was also very interesting is that in this part of the study, we do see that the object is observed and being picked as most preferred at a much higher rate compared to the humans in the story. So just some really interesting things and some different ways to, again, use chi-square when we're looking at these comparisons, whether what you're observing is close to or different to what's expected. This is just another graph looking at this as well for the rocket. Yeah, so I think I hit on that. So I'm going to just go past this again. Just again, this was one of the examples of methods or an analysis that I thought would be interesting to look at for those individuals who are, again, utilizing these categorical variables. Using a chi-square test can help you determine, is there a difference in your population, especially when you're looking at what's observed and what's expected. So this is one tool that you can utilize to help you analyze that. So now moving into the qualitative. Now, again, I said from the beginning, I tend to consider myself to be more of a quantitative. So I like to say that these are qualitatively informed methods, but I think still worthwhile types of methods to utilize to, again, get some of that depth that I described at the beginning when we were going over qualitative versus quantitative. So as I showed with my methods, when I had the 2 book or 3 book covers, I would ask, which one would you like to read and why? So the why is what allowed me to then look deeply at some of the rationales for their preferences. So this is, didn't get that. Okay. So I utilized Strauss and Corbin's 3-step procedure to analyze my qualitative data, which, again, this is just sort of generally speaking, this includes doing some kind of open coding, formulating some axial codes, and then fine-tuning those into even more selective codes. And so this is my understanding of the way to do it, and also the way I try to utilize it in my study. So when looking at open coding, this is you're scrutinizing, you're separating, you're putting into categories, seeing if there are things that are different or similar, seeing what emerged again from your data, and using that as sort of a first step. Then your axial codes, you might find that there are some things that do have some similarities that might be able to be condensed into a separate category. So this is continuing to refine and refine. And what I found from doing some of this, and from what I understand of qualitative data, this is a continual process of you having to fine tune until you get to a point where you think like, yes, I think I captured what is present within my data. So I'll just give you a quick kind of indication or example of the way I went about it. And so what you have here is an example of a rationale for a child. Now, IMV is just the interviewer, CHI is the child. So here the interviewer says that one, okay, why would you like to read this one? And the child said, well, mostly because I think the white skin color looks cooler. And just from here, I can see some differences that I like a little better. And so the interviewer says, okay, why don't you want to read this one? And the child says, this one, the eye color is different and the skin is darker. So that's one narrative. Now, I went through and automatically I could already see some indications that part of this child's rationale does have to do with race or skin color. So I would go through, and really I often use lots of colors. I find that that's helpful for me to use different colors as I'm going through the different narratives, transcripts that I have, adding colors, and then I'll write labels in the margin, add some more colors. And then if I need to go back through again to go through the selective coding or any of those other aspects, then I will update my colors and go that way. And so here, the child mentioning skin color, eye color, having some differences. He says, I can see some differences. Positive statement, white skin color looks cooler. So this is one example. Here's another. This is now the game. And so the interview says, what about here? Which one would you like to read? This one. Okay, why would you want to read this one? Because for more in sports, I think black skin color looks cool. And why would you not want to read this one? Mostly because I can see a few differences in that also. So again, utilizing the same sort of lens that I was trying to create as I was doing this qualitative analysis, qualitative informed analysis, indicating skin color, talking about differences, and using that to really determine my codes. So now I want to show you how I continue to do this, and with additional iterations of it led to the categories that I discovered. So here again, we have some examples tied to skin and eye color. Then I would go through and see, okay, here's some examples tied to differences or comparisons that the child notes. I can also see that there are some positive statements. This looks cool, looks better. There's some discussion about actions or activities like sports in this case. And then whether there's a specific racial preference. As you see, I put this in black. I think black color, skin color looks cool. That being now kind of showing that there's a preference at least being discussed or in this narrative. So, like I said, continuing to refine, creating categories, making differentiations, starting to see if there are things that I can lump together. For example, characteristics linked to race, like mentions of skin color, hair color. Were there positive comments or negative comments? Were there specific comments tied to, I like this, I don't like this? Same thing looking at, again, comments related to actions or general comments. And so this is, like I said, just a taste of the analysis that I went through when I was trying to see, well, what's going to emerge from these children's preferences when they're explaining why they picked the book they did or didn't. And so it's really me trying to let the data speak for itself in the best way that I can. Now, I do know, again, I told you I tend to where the quantitative had a little bigger. I did know that my data did have some racial aspects tied to it, but still trying to really let the children's words speak for themselves as I was putting these things into categories. So I was going to do this. I'm not going to for time, but what I was going to do was give you, I found some of the President Nelson's messages that he sends out to everyone. And I was going to have you kind of go through and see if you could do some color coding and see if there are some messages or things that emerge as topics or themes that emerge across a couple of his messages. If you want to do that on your own, you can email me and I'll send you what I have, and you can kind of play with that again, just to get some practice with doing some of that coding, qualitative coding. So I want to show these from this specific study. These were the actual patterns that emerged, and I'll show you kind of how I guess, define them and some examples of what this looked like. One of the patterns that emerged from looking at all of the children's preferences was like an ambiguous answer or something like the same. So if a child said something like, I don't know, when asked, well, why do you want to read this? I don't know. Or if their answer noted that both look the same, because this one looks the same as that one. Or when children made comments about a pattern they were using to select a book. So for example, a 5-year-old African-American male said, I'm going by the pattern, black, white, black, white, black, white. So it's kind of ambiguous to his reasoning for why he picked the book. The next one is general reference to book character or action of character. So could be a general comment related to what the child saw on the cover, but these references did not show approval or disapproval, and they were not related to race. So because there's flowers, or because he's pointing at his mouth. So just sort of general references to what the child saw on the book or the character that wasn't necessarily tied to race. Next being references that are race related. So something that tied to skin or black or eye color. And so the child's reasons for selecting this, like I said, was tied to that in some way. And so an example of because he's black, said a 5-year-old black male, or I don't want to read a book with a person with dark skin, said a 6-year-old white female child. So that is what I was looking for then based on what emerged and how they fit into that category. Another one was connection back to self or own life or personal experience. So this might be a child is making comments that brings themselves, ties themselves to the book. So for example, because it reminds me of when I had a loose tooth, or because I'm the same color. And so some of those connections back to self were coded as another category as well. And then another aspect was tied to approval or disapproval of attributions. So for example, approval for the approval one, predictions of positive behavior that would be carried out. So for example, the child said, he looks like he's being kind of nice to the bug. So he's making an assumption about what this character is doing, and then a positive type of assumption. Or he's going to kick the ball faster. And the opposite side of that is a disapproval or negative attribution. So because he doesn't want to make it in the score, because he's just going to eat all the cookies. So this is what went into, again, my how my categories emerged and how the data informed these categories and helped me to look at this qualitative data in a different way. Now, again, having a little bit of quantitative, it's hard for me to separate from that. Then I did some tallying and saw kind of the number of times some of these things emerged. And it just, again, giving this this kind of clear indication of what the preferences showed. So I am running out of time. This is, again, just this idea of tying it all together, the quantitative and qualitative types of methods, allowing for breadth and depth to emerge in the data that you collect and in some of the methodologies that you utilize. And so as I showed here, I tried to find a way to do both of these in a way to get this more nuanced understanding of children's preferences, but also some of the rationales for why they picked the books that they did. And I'm going to really quickly just mention this. I don't have time to go into it as much. I did a similar sort of thing, analyzing the narratives. And actually, I'm still in the process of analyzing the narratives. So this is analyzing narrative ability. This is a method that's used very often. You'd give children a wordless picture book. You allow them to flip through that book to see what's going on, and then you ask them to tell you the story, and they'll flip the page and tell you the story. So Frog, Where Are You by Mercer Mayer is one that's used very often, but as you see, it's a white male. So I took that and I don't have images of it, but I took a similar sort of thing, but added black and white characters to see, is there a difference in narrative quality? And this allows me to look at things like overall quality of the story children are telling, microstructures, meaning, looking at the actual language they're using, the total number of words, etc. So these would very much be the quantitative piece, macrostructures. There's an actual rubric that you can use to see if those things are there. And of course, you can count up the total number of words the child uses. But then later, looking at some of those qualitative pieces, are there themes or patterns that emerged in the stories that children told? And was there a difference when it was a white character versus a black character? So mixed methodology, from at least my experience in continuing to do this work, like I said, allows for a little bit more of this nuanced understanding of some of the things that you are investigating. And I like this because you could think of quantitative being sort of like the tip of the iceberg, but there's so much more depth that can be happening below the surface. And so utilizing both of those helps you to capture that in a more nuanced way. So that is my presentation for today. I think I left 5.5 minutes for questions.